All right. Thank you for joining us. You're here live with us for another segment of HAPI Talks, and I am your host, Elena. We have a lot in store for you this week as we count down the premiere of our HAPI documentary film that's premiering this Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are going to feature many of the cast members live on our HAPI Talks at 7 p.m., and we have one here with us today, and his name is Brother Asar Imhotep. He is a software developer, cultural theorist, and Africologist from Houston, Texas, who research focuses on the cultural, linguistic, and philosophical links between ancient Egyptian and modern Bantu cultures of Central and Southern Africa. Asar is the founder of Madu Ndela Institute and the Martin Delany Center for Egyptology. He is also the co-founder of Black Science Month, which is celebrated in October and highlights the historical and current achievements of Africans in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. He is our guest today. He's Brother Asar Imhotep. Thank you for joining us, brother. How are you? Thank you. Welcome. How are you?
Peace and blessings. Peace and blessings. I am well. I am well. I am alive. I am COVID free. And I am blessed to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Thank you. So let's get right into the HAPI film in which you are a cast member and you share your expertise. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the HAPI film as a cast member?
Well, as you noted in the biography, I am one who studies ancient Egypt and alongside the Bantu cultures, Bantu being a language family, and which the language spreads from Cameroon all the way to Uganda to Southern Africa, like South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, etc. And so this has led me over the years in terms of finding these connections between these groups of people, the ancient Egyptians and the modern Bantu cultures, to extending that analysis in terms of language, philosophy, religion, and culture in general, to various different communities in West Africa. So I've been looking at these cultural and linguistic continuities and asking the questions, well, what are the possible reasons that we're finding these similarities? Is it a result of chance, just a coincidence? Or is it a result of inheritance, meaning that there's a proto culture and family from which these modern cultures and even the ancient cultures had spread as a result of, the descendants of the primary culture spreading out and traveling all throughout Africa? Or is it the result of, intercontinental or internilotic trade? And, over the years, I've come to understand and accept all of those as possible answers, depending on the nature of the question. And so as a result of basically 20 years of that type of study, according to Brother Taki, Dr. Raketiaman, who's also a cast member of the film, recommended me to, discuss and add a little bit more of that research to the HAPI film, so that there is some sense of, again, continuity in terms of especially West and Central Africans and the HAPI Valley, so that we make the connections that it's not only in terms of the history and the culture and the philosophy that makes ancient Egypt great, that those same aspects of the broader mother culture exist in the Niger River Valley, saying cultures that exist in West Africa, for example. And that, much of what you see in Egypt, you'll see in West Africa. So, the same activities that you see going on in Egypt in the ancient days, you see in the modern era, and even, the not so historical era, that kind of concretizes and make it a little bit more real and not foreign, to us who study Africa in that capacity.
Right. And then how did that, so you talk about Kemet and its influence in particular to Western Africa, but
Mhm.
how did the Nile River and other river valleys influence the course of civilization in general?
Well, it's very primitive in terms of the answer to that question, because all living things require water in order to live and survive. So, on the most fundamental level, it is simply an issue of existing near and living near freshwater reservoirs and rivers so that we could survive. And so, you had in the more and more ancient times, we're talking 20, 30,000 years ago, communities migrating from the Great Lakes regions in modern day Ethiopia, Uganda, etc. What we call, up down the Nile, because the flow of the Nile River is, opposite of what we normally see across the world. And so as a result of those migrations, you had certain people settle along the Nile. But there was a period where the monsoon rains that normally, flood the Nile, they expanded up north further into what is called the Sahara, nowadays. And as a result of decades and centuries of consistent rainfall, the desert became savanna and grassland. And there was a lot of game, animals, and wildlife that moved into what is now the Sahara, what we call the Green Sahara. And as a result of that, us being hunter gatherers at the time, we followed the herds, we followed the animals into the Green Sahara. Well, as a result of the Worm Glacial Ice Period um, happening in Europe and sucking up all the moisture from that region, the monsoon rains stopped coming all the way up to the Sahara. And so they only went up to a certain point. But as a result of that, now the Sahara starts drying again. And as a result of that, the animals are either dying off due to starvation, and things of that nature, and or migrated further south in all directions. And of course, we're following the herds. We're looking for water sources. We are also, in terms of the African human beings, are migrating down in different directions. So anywhere from like 6,000, to 3,200 BCE, there's different waves of migrations of these Africans going into modern day Nigeria, into Chad, and of course into the Sudan and what is now modern Egypt, going through Libya, whatnot. So these groups of people are not stopping until they find great big sources of water. So for some of them that came down, it was the Niger River. Some went further down into the Zaire River and Congo River in those areas. Others locating and stopping near Lake Chad. And then, of course, those who migrate, towards the right, if you're looking at, the map of Africa in the Nile Valley. So now, to answer your question, how does it, become a central part? So again, they're looking for water and they're settling. So you have different communities, different speech communities over periods of time settling in this area. And now they have to figure out a way to live amongst each other. And they're intermarrying with each other down and now. They're building now a common culture, and one language ultimately dominates for a while, and the Pharaonic Egypt starts, and all this melding of these different African groups form a confederacy. And this is how Pharaonic Egypt comes into being. But it all starts first and foremost with finding viable water sources. and then of course just food in general. And so those individuals who were already settled on it now from previously, who never left, and now have these incomers, coming from the west and the south of of Egypt of that time in terms of its borders. And this causes a series of activities over time, and the civilization itself bubbles.
Right. So now, as groups are spreading out, what are you seeing in your research and your studies? What are you seeing are some of the things, the commonalities, some things that just remained, that stayed within these groups as they left the Nile Valley? For instance, as far as names, what names do they use to call chief or leader? The things, as far as language is concerned, what are you seeing that just continues to remain as
it really just depends on where the people left. Like, for example, there's a group of individuals called the Collagen. And the Collagen people have an oral tradition that everyone knows in the culture, which argues that they come from ancient Egypt, and is very detailed in terms of where they used to live in a place called Cho. We would call it Jedu in terms of the Delta area. And during the time, like a little bit after the Greeks, they, migrated down and now through the Sudan, and now exist in Uganda, Congo, Kenya, and the western parts of Ethiopia. Now, they brought with them all kinds of words that exist in the language. Now, the Collagen people were a military branch of the ancient Egyptians. And so in Africa, pre-colonial Africa, whole ethnic groups had jobs in given societies. And so it's kind of, hard for us to contemplate that in the modern day, because we go to school as individuals and we train for a particular position, and that's what we do. And if we have children, they go on and do their own thing. That wasn't the case in pre-colonial Africa. So your ethnic group was known for doing a certain thing, and in this case, this ethnic group, they were a branch of the military. That's what they were. They were nomadic pastoralists who had a job as a military wing of ancient Egypt. So, when they came down, words that they brought with them, for example, was names like, Isis, which is the goddess, which is now kind of representative of the supreme being amongst them, which is also a word for sun. And so there's an individual by the name of Dr. Kipkuich Sambu, who has written 2 texts about this. So, and what's interesting about him is that, he grew up with these stories, and, he wanted to find out to what degree were these true. And so he ended up going to South Africa in the School of Egyptology and Coptology, got an Egyptology degree, and his dissertation was on the oral tradition of his people, coming from ancient Egypt. And so he kind of outlines all of that. And for example, when we say, we say ma'at, but in the Collagen they say ma'at. And ma'at is this cultural paradigm, that in terms of a social obligation that everyone in the society has for one another. It's an obligation to help one another in need, and so they greet each other with the word mat. It's an actual greeting. And so, but it's also an actual brotherhood. It's also an actual sisterhood. It's a whole system of social steering, taboos and do's and don'ts, for that particular society. And when you study it in the context of ancient Egypt and in the Collagen, you can see that it is still a continuation of that paradigm, from ancient Egypt. And so, this is just one example of terms. And then you got like goddesses from like Sekhmet, when some of the families from ancient Egypt and the Sudan migrated west, they brought the goddess Sekhmet with them. And so now in Benin, Togo, and Yoruba land, she is known as Sokpono or Sekpato or Sekpata among the airway, and individuals down in Benin and Togo. And so, you have this, and then you have like Imana in Rwanda, in terms of Amen and the god. And matter of fact, if you don't mind, I will share a screenshot.
Oh, absolutely.
I'll just share my screen. And you let me know when you can see certain things.
We got it up.
Okay. So, for example, there's an individual by the name of Yoro Jiao who was born around 1847 and died April 3rd, 1919. This individual writes about the migrations from ancient Egypt all the way to Senegal. And there were 6 migrations that he speaks about. That is the basis of oral tradition, just like amongst the colleges. And so you have these different migrations, and the people settling in Senegal, we don't know necessarily if they were just raw into Senegal and there was no one there, or did they settle among people. But one of the way that you can tell that a group of people have settled among, or there was interaction, is loan words. And so the loan words in the Wolof language speaks volumes. So this is a text here by Abubakri Musalam. It's in French, but I'm going to translate it to English. The Sahara, or the Valley of the Nile. And he kind of outlines the relationship between the Wolof and the Fulani with ancient Egyptian. He has a whole text on the Fulani, the Egyptian origins of the Fulani in West Africa. So I won't read this, but this is just here for notes. Anybody want to come back and pause it at this point and read, just because he's outlining the 6 migrations. So this is just 2 of the migrations. Okay. But you asked me about the words. And so, loan words are more common with cultural items or trade items. So like for instance, in Middle Egyptian, we have this word jes. We don't know what the vowels were because they didn't write the vowels at this period. And it's a word for knife. And then we have mijes, knife. This M is a prefix, an abstract prefix, M. So majes, which is knife. And then the Wolof language, you have jasi, blade, dagger, hatchet, das, to sharpen. This is important because in Yoro Jiao's, in his argument that the Wolof folks came from ancient Egypt, he talks about the first wave of people being metallurgists. So, I summarize it here. I say in the first migration composed of Jiaogo, Jiao highlighted that they migrated out of Egypt armed with metal, hogo, sagas, sabers, daggers, and knives, bringing along with them armor, as well as their industrious wisdom of metallurgy. They inaugurated the sorghum culture to prevent flooding from the Senegal River. The migration took place under the king of Egypt, identified as Pate Lamene. The words, whether used separately or together, are used among the Mandinka, the Pules or the Fulani, the Kasonke, the Sarakole, and to some extent amongst the Wolof. So he's saying here with this first migration, It was the people who dealt with metallurgy. So it's no surprise that you would see in Wolof, metallurgical terms
Right. Mm-hmm.
that were borrowed. So, in terms of jas, knife, jasi, blade, dagger, hatchet, etc. And jam, to pierce, to penetrate. Wolof, jam, to stab, puncture, prick, to tattoo, etc. And just for continuity, I put Jim, worm, Jj, a sacred snake, and then John, snake.
Mm-hmm.
So when these are just examples of ways that you can detect these migrations, into West Africa, because it's going to be fossilized, in the language.
Okay. Okay. Great. So you talked about quite a bit there, and I want to back up a little bit because you mentioned the gods, and it's not always the most accurate word to describe these forces of nature personified. But I want you to speak a little bit more about how from one place to another you still see the similarities between these deities. So, for instance, how is Ra connected to Ogun?
That's a lecture unto itself.
Okay, yeah.
Because I would have to do a linguistic lesson. So this is one of those instances where it's not a case of migrations. It is a case of inheritance.
And Brother Asar, can I just pan into? Are you done with this sharing your screen? Can I?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Let me just bring you out. Okay, please continue.
Yes, it is one of those cases of, how should I say, of inheritance and not of borrowing or a result of trade, in terms of migrations. Mm-hmm. And so that in the proto language, in the proto culture, they pronounce words a certain way. Right. But as time goes on and their descendants isolate themselves, further migrating further and further away, dialects form. But then over time, these dialects become non-intelligible to each other. So this is, in linguistics, we consider them different languages at this point because we can't understand each other. And so, but, for a trained linguist, we can look at the language and tell that they're related, even though if they were simply to try to have a conversation with each other, it wouldn't seem that they were related. But, a scientific analysis will demonstrate that they are. So what happens over time is that words evolve in terms of their pronunciation. And in this case, you have a proto word that ultimately in the Yoruba language became Ogun, but in the ancient Egyptian language, we pronounce it as Ra, but it was more like Reche, Rekawa, or Rigwe, something like that. I discussed that in, hope you don't mind a shameless plug, but in this book, Aluja, Volume 2. And so in the second half of the book, I go through all of that. And so it's one of those things that is not intuitive. Like when you hear Ogun and then when you hear Ra, you're not thinking similarities in terms of pronunciation. And so this is why we have a systematic way of demonstrating that this, in fact, is the case. And so, with that said, on that level is dealing with, kind of fire and propagation. And so the O in Ogun nominalizes a primary verb or adjective. And so in, how should I say, Ra in ancient Egypt is really kind of a coalescence of different words and concepts. So how our ancient African ancestors used to do, they look for the similarities in things. And if two or more things sounded alike or looked alike or
Mm-hmm.
appeared in their mind to have similar functionality, they would synthesize those things and make a conglomerate, out of those particular concepts, kind of meld it,
Mm-hmm.
together. And this is how a lot of our culture came to be. And so there's a reason why that you see Ra with a sun disk on his head, with a hawk face, with a snake wrapped around. If you've ever seen a depiction of Ra, that's because in ancient times, all three of those concepts sounded alike. And so in linguistics, we call this phenomenon paronymy. And paronymy is the phenomenon that where a speech community sees a word that is, or two or more words that sound alike, and believe that a priori there's necessarily a relationship between the two. And then they synthesize it, and what I'm saying, from there. So it's kind of a word play thing. So but yeah, their connection is on dealing with kingship, it's dealing with sunlight or fire and creation, on one hand, or putting things in order and building in terms of kingship, I mean kingdoms and society and things of that nature. So and ironically, Ra and Ma'at, and this is another book that's coming up in the future, are the same deity. And so Ma'at represents order in the abstract, it already set. Ra represents the word order, actually to put in order, the actual process of ordering things, making things right and exact. And you'll find out that those are the words for kings, because that's the result of a king. This is why everyone's a Sa-Ra, a son of Ra, because you are the personification, of the mechanism by which order and prosperity is exist within a society.
Right, right. Okay. And could you elaborate on the various ways the Ankh symbols show up throughout Africa?
I wouldn't necessarily say the Ankh symbol
Okay.
shows up throughout Africa more so than the various variations of the words
Okay.
itself. But one place that it shows up in a unique way is in Ghana. And so the root of the word Ankh, we pronounce it as Ankh, but it's more like Hanga or Henga in the ancient Egyptian language. But the root of that, it has two prefixes, the H, which is like a prefix of agent, the N, also another agent prefix, but the root is H. Now, in Ghana, and even in Congo, they pronounce it Nkwa in terms of life. Now, when you go to Ghana, you'll see these dolls. And when a woman wants to get pregnant, the ritual is, or the process is, of course, we all know what they have to do to get pregnant. But if they can't utilize that natural mechanism to get pregnant, what they will do is go to a shaman, a priest, an elder, or whatnot, and let them know their concerns. And what the elder or priest will do is say, you need to go to this wood carver, and you need to get a ka waba doll, or inkwaba, inkwaba doll. And so the word ba simply means child, and the word nkwa is the word for life. So inkwaba doll, that's what you call them. Now, these little dolls are made of wood, and you'll see them with the the round head, the little arms and vertical body like the Ankh. Now, what the women do is they will wear the Inkwaba doll on their backs. So you know how, like, you see in Africa when the women wrap themselves up with the baby, saying in the back, you would do the same thing. So this is the secret before the secret. if you remember that film, and how everybody would say that you need to do a vision board, right? Because if you do a vision board, that which you seek is, and you see it all the time, and you're working towards that goal, it's imprinted on your mind, and so that your intent and your will, resonates with the universe to bring this into being, in your real life. So it's the same thing with the Inqua, the Ankh dolls that you bring, because you're trying to bring a life in you. So you must act as if it already exists around you. So you draw that life energy, and of course, I would still have to continue that process, to bring it, and then hopefully a child results as it. So this is how the Ankh exists, in one area in West Africa, in Ghana.
Okay. And so let's back up a little bit, because you mentioned the Wolof, and there's a story here that I would like for you to elaborate on as far as the legend of their migrations. A two-part question. So speak a little bit about the legend of their migration from Kemet, and also just whether or not the language of the Wolof in Senegal is, whether or not it's a derivative of Meta-Neter.
I wouldn't say it's a derivative. I would say that it's a sister language.
Okay.
Yeah, and with some loan words from ancient Egypt. And in terms of the migrations, that's what I was talking about earlier, from Jao, Yara, or Yaro Jao, I mean. And so we got to understand that when he wrote this was in the early 1900s. And so there's no Egyptology in Senegal. They have no benevolent white Egyptologists coming in and trying to influence them and say, hey, y'all may be from, ancient Egypt. This was already a part of the culture. And so the author was commissioned to write the history of his people. So that's all he was doing, was recording that. And so, this is like in 1910, 1911 that I think this was written. And so it's, again, there's 6 different migrations. So I already gave you one, which is talk about the metallurgists that came through, and the name of the pharaoh for which they were fleeing. And so it just goes one after another in terms of these migrations. So they weren't one migration. It wasn't one long migration. It was 6 different waves of individuals over time. And so, and this is before the work of Diop. As a matter of fact, I don't even think Diop was aware of this text. And as Dr. Alam, Abubakri Musalam, mentioned in the text that I showed. And so, that is something, that has to be, but again, it's in French. And I think we have a good brother who has translated at least Abubakri Musalam's excerpts from the text. But, it's a big text. So, someone would have to translate that in English for people to really get. But if you speak French or you read French, I would encourage you to look up that name and look up that work, so that you'll get a sense of what exactly was going on. But there's many different migrations, in different parts of West Africa that we have oral traditions for.
Right. So speaking of another group, what are some of the cultural and ethnic links between the tribes, like Ashanti and Kemet?
Again, it's like I wish I would have put some photos up with them, because like it's subtle.
Okay.
You would have to know Kemet to really know it. And this is something that matter of fact, I wrote an article way back in 2009, and I just did a revamp for the Killmonger Journal, a journal started by our good brother Black Panther with the Mosi warrior clan, who have their own shows and lectures and whatnot. But one of the things that I discussed in that is it's called the African Superhighway of Wisdom.
Okay.
And in the African Superhighway of Wisdom, I discussed how a lot of similarities exist across Africa because groups of individuals would travel just to learn and get wisdom from other ethnic groups. Like there was a caravan path in different parts of Africa that people travel to this date just to get initiations and get wisdom from different African traditions. But one of the key things that for anyone who has actually traveled on this African superhighway of wisdom, is that there's a phraseology to speak in your own name, never in mine. Meaning that, you know, take in the teachings and the skills and stuff that I show you, but you have to adapt it in a way that is true to your destiny. And so this is what happens. There's certain things that change. So if you, matter of fact, I can show you better than I can tell you.
Okay.
If you can share that screen again, I'll find a couple of photos and show you what I mean. Going into, so for example, when you go amongst the Yoruba, there's a lot of like these are depictions on the left hand side in ancient Egypt of Nubians. Notice the scarification on the side and on the forehead and the hairstyle that you see here.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's also discussions of people who are of Yoruba descent who come from Sudan, which is Nubia. And on the right hand side is Yoruba artwork, you know, from like the early 1900s, maybe the late 1800s, of the same hairstyles and a different type of marking on the forehead. But you'll see others with the same tribal marks on the cheeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the Yoruba migrated, well, some of the Yoruba, you know, who came from the Sudan migrated, they're the ones who created the Nok Society. And this is the old Nok terracotta. So you see the same scarification.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an old item from the Nok Society that you find with the sister here, that you also find with here, you know. And so these are things that we have to make. But we also notice the snake on the forehead motifs. Now, you know, you should be familiar with that, of course, in ancient Kemet, like for example, this Tut almond mask, in terms of the vulture and the cobra on the forehead. And you see this again amongst Yoruba, except they changed the vulture to this kind of duck, but still with the snake motifs. They change it up a bit depending on the materials and things that they have to work with in the place and where they're at. And so you see the same thing here. This is a child of Yoruba, you know, a Yoruba god of Obatala. This is the child of Obatala from Ile Ife. This is from 1000 to 1500 AD. This is of a pygmy. Notice the open mouth tongue and the skull pendant around it. You find this same motif in ancient Egypt. So this is the god Bes. Open mouth, you would normally see the tongue here with the chain, with the skull chain. And so now the bottom part is missing from this representation here.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll see in that area that this is common. So now this is a motif from Benin. A little different in the head, but the same thing. Skull pendant necklace, and you see the waist around, and with the bow leg wob knee. This is from Cameroon. This is the baby version, you know, of that. And so I'm gonna continue down, going back to, you know, what we see. So we have, for example, the Ga Adangbe. These are also people in Ghana. And so you see these shrines, these step pyramid shrines, you know, to the ancestors and to the deities, which they call Otutu shrines.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see the same thing. Here's, the pyramids in Sudi village, step pyramid shrines in Nigeria, amongst the Igbo people. And so, of course, you see in Saqqara the step pyramid, which is also a shrine, a temple, for where, allegedly, many of the pharaohs were buried. A lot of them, there was no burials of the pharaohs, but they're shrines that, you would call on that ancestor to come, which is why you have the pyramid texts, what they call the pyramid texts and stuff, with rituals and things to call on these powerful ancestors. And so this is in the Sudan, among the New Era people, or whatnot. But it was something that I was going to and this is a moon, in Ghana, but that's a linguistic thing. I don't want to go there, but this is something that I want to show in terms of ancient Kush and the Meroitic. So this is, a moon with the stake on his head, just kind of like what we saw earlier amongst King Tutankhamun.
Mm-hmm.
This is Meroitic again. This is Amen in Nubia. This is just a little pendant, and this is from 743 to 712 BC or BCE, the Patan Nubian period from Pianki. And we see another variant, here, but which is unique right here is because you see these golden cowrie shells at the bottom. So you still see the ram, you still see the sun, snake, or whatnot with Amun.
And can you really quickly talk about the history of cowrie shells?
Yes, and that's what I'm getting to. So I'm going to kind of kill two birds with one stone.
Okay.
So, we got to remember that HAPI is dealing with economics,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're exchanging goods and services, for profit. And in the ancient days, they would do this over long distances in terms of trade caravans or whatnot. But, when we're talking about these West African and East African and Nile Valley connections, these are the things that we have to show and demonstrate. It's not enough to just say it,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to demonstrate it. So this, again, is still a Meroitic emblem with the cowrie shells. This one's dated to 35 BCE to 20 BCE.
Yeah.
So now, as we discussed, the origin of the use of cowrie shells. And so the presence of cowries in Africa can be traced back as early as the 8th century. They come from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean to West Africa through North Africa to the middle Niger in the 11th century, spreading southwards to the Guinea Forest and then to the Niger Delta. So when you see all those creative motifs in West Africa with cowrie shells, they don't originate there. What people got to understand is that cowrie was used as currency in ancient Egypt. And this is how the cowrie spread. And so I won't read that, but I'll just show this is, from Queen Candace's necklace. And you can't really see it, but there's the cowrie shells at the bottom of this particular necklace. So we saw this kind of motif that you see right here, in this Meroitic emblem, this one here, or whatnot. It's just a common necklace thing with the cowries at the bottom. So now we go to Benin in West Africa. What do we see here? So this isn't ancient Egyptian. This is Benin, Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're imitating the cowries with these things at the bottom here, but it's the same collar motif with the ram's horn. With the ram's head, saying at top. And this is a different one on the right. And this is what I mean by speaking in your own name, never in mine. They take the motifs. So remember that the people from the Sudan migrated and set up a metallurgical society and priesthood. And this is part of the motif. So you're seeing Amen in that particular area. And here's another variant, from the Edo people. So now it becomes part of the culture amongst the Yoruba in that area. And here's another one that is, again, not ancient Egyptian. This is West African.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not a coincidence. This is a result of migrations.
Wow. Okay. That's
So
great. Great. So before we continue on, I just want to make sure I do some couple of announcements. So thank you for joining us. If you are just joining us, we are speaking with Brother Asar Imhotep, and you are with HAPI Talks as we count down the premiere of the HAPI documentary that will be premiering this Saturday, July 18th at 7 p.m. You can get your tickets if you see it down there, www.hapifilm.com. We have a couple more questions. So if you have questions for Brother Asar, please put it in your comments and we will get to them after we're done. So Brother Asar, what we're trying to do is just to make sure there's a couple of tribes that, in general that folks may know about, in particular from West Africa. And so we just want, if you could name a couple others, and if you can highlight some of those similarities or the things that came from Kemet that this group may have adopted into their culture. So one in particular, if you can talk a little bit more about the Dinka peoples, and if we can trace the link to West Africa and the Mandinka people, and in particular, in what ways?
yeah, when it comes to those, that was a question that was posed to me even for the film.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that you can, like, they're related, but it's distantly related.
Okay.
So like the Dinka people in the Sudan and the Mandinka in West Africa, they split a very long time ago. And matter of fact, when you read Cheikh Anta Diop's work, this is what you see. But matter of fact, if you have Diop's, it's not Civilization of Barbarism, it's African Origins of Civilization, Myth or Reality, that he goes and shows you that the same names that you'll find in Sudan for just ethnic groups and families, you'll find in Senegal amongst his people. And so, but there's also another thing that you got to keep in mind is that, again, whole groups, there may have been whole villages, but it wasn't large amounts of people like a biblical exodus that was leaving Egypt migrating. These were families, different rural people who lived in different rural areas, communities. It may have been 30 or 40, at a time. What they'll do is they'll migrate and then integrate into the society. So they become the name of the people that live there in the place that they migrate. So, it's different ways of detecting that. The only way that you can detect that is that they'll still have some oral tradition that says where their families came from. And that's the case with people in Ghana and whatnot. But they came and integrated themselves into this population that already existed. And so this is common all throughout Africa. Matter of fact, the Collagen people, they speak a so-called Nilotic language.
Right.
It is very different than the Bantu languages, but they have Bantu speakers who came and adopted Collagen culture and now speak Collagen. But historically, their ancestors were Bantu speaking people who migrated from Central Africa into East Africa. And and so this stuff happens all of the time. So we got to be open to the fact that you're not going to take whole names. You're probably not going to find whole names because these families that migrated landed in a certain space and integrated with the people that already existed. However, they would bring their language and culture, and so certain cultural words were added to the language, certain rituals and certain deities like Sekhmet that I mentioned earlier, amongst the Ewe and the Yoruba and the Edo and the Ijama folks, in that southwest area of Nigeria. Whereas in Ghana, it's Amen. Like people who worship and was part of the Amen heritage of ancient Egypt, those folks landed in certain parts of modern day Ghana. And it's hard to pinpoint what the original names and spiritual traditions are of people in Senegal and Senegambia, because now the vast majority of them people have been Muslimized. And so as a result of the Muslim religion, the indigenous religion has fallen off the map in many respects. So you really got to hunt and dig for folks who still practice their indigenous religion in Senegal. You know, so it's, you know, history has made things kind of difficult depending on what area you live in. But according to, you know, for example, Dr. Mubabinga Bololo, aspects of the Baluba people, you know, moved down from the Nile Valley into Congo. And it's possible that they could have been a quote unquote or a branch of the so-called Libyans, you know, in terms of the Baluba, the Libyans in that area. So I'm still investigating that, you know, taking the lead of Dr. Mubabinga Bololo to see if his argument has merit.
So let's talk about the math and the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
What influence does ancient Kemet have on the math and science that you see in certain groups, such as the Dogon people of Mali?
Well, it's kind of hard in terms of math. We don't know too much math coming out of the Dogon per se. You know, the Dogon are people that are related to the people in ancient Egypt, but they're an early offshoot. Like at the time of the Sahara splitting, like, you know, so these are folks who lived in the Sahara and then migrated, but they kept certain of the old traditions that some of the ancient Egyptians kept in the Nile Valley. So like you'll see on wall paintings, you know, in certain regions of the Sahara that, you know, predate Egypt 1,000 or so years. But the motifs and emblems that you see on the wall arise in ancient Egypt. But you'll see some of them same motifs in West Africa, amongst like the Fulani and Dogon and stuff to this nature. And so just like the Dogon celebrate the Sigu festival, and it's the same thing in ancient Egypt. Well, with their Sigu festival, you know, it's like an every 50 or 60 year festival. So with the Dogon, for example, they're more astronomy, you know, because they used to have to walk in the deserts and travel long distances late at night. So for them, the stars were the basis. So they were dealing with divinations and philosophy and stuff like that. But with the mathematics, you know, you can see more so the evolution of the mathematics that became what you saw in ancient Egypt coming out of Congo some 23,000, 40,000 years ago with the Ashango bone. And if you ever heard about the Ashango bone, it was found in Ashango, which is in the Congo. The same adding and multiplying system that you find on the Ashango bone, you see later on in ancient Egypt, which we call in mathematics the 2n system. And so the reason why the mathematics expanded in ancient Egypt is because they had writing. And it's hard to do complex math without writing. So the Dogon didn't have writing. So you don't see an elaborate mathematical treatise from them. Whereas with ancient Egypt, they have writing. They don't have to try to memorize, you know, a whole bunch. They can write it down on paper and work it out. And that's why, you know, ancient Egypt was able to expand on, you know, saying the primitive systems that you still find in various parts of Africa itself. But that counting system, that multiplication system that even exists in the computers that we're on now is based on that system that you find originating out of the Congo amongst the Ashango bone and the Limpopo bone, going up the Nile. Because remember, as I discussed, they went up the Nile and settled. And so we know where they came from ultimately, you know, in terms of the Great Lakes region.
And would the binary system be included in that?
Yes, that's you know, that's what gives rise to your modern computers. And the person who came up with the binary system, you know, was studying the divination systems of Europe and Africa. And it is from that dang, I forgot his name. He has a book on African fractals, and he discusses it in that text. So if you can find African fractals, you'll find the author. The name slips me,
And
but
could you define what the binary system is, just so we know what we're talking
oh, it's just binary is literally by two
about. Hmm.
system. So in computer language, we say zeros and ones. So and that's really kind of convenient for our ears. But for the computer itself, is light on, light off.
Okay.
And so that's a zero represents light off, and a one represents light on. And so your computer itself is a binary system of gates that open and shut, that let electricity through, or it doesn't let electricity through. And that combination, ultimately through transistors and lights and things of that nature, becomes what you see on the screen, or whatnot. But it's the same thing when you do in the EFA system, in
Hmm.
terms of when the Babalawo drops the Ipele chain and he marks the Odus. It's in a binary system.
Yeah.
So he marks one for light and two for darkness. It's the same binary system, and that's what you see. When if you're familiar with Dr. Charles S. Finch, he has a book called A Star Deep Beginnings, and he does an excellent job of discussing the ancient Egyptian binary system and the 2n multiplication system that emerges out of that, and then how it becomes later on the influence in our modern computers.
Mm. So we have some questions from our viewers, and I think we'll take Teresa's because it deals with the binary system and just the influence that ancient Kemet had on the rest of the world. So we're speaking a lot about how that influence, how you see that show up in West Africa, but could you speak a little bit about just how it shows up in other parts of the world?
Again, the binary system, for the most part, shows up a lot in terms of divination. It's from the divination systems that inspired the binary ways in which the computers have emerged. But there's direct ways and indirect ways. And so we have to go to, for example, the ancient Greeks, who came into Africa and studied, philosophy and mathematics and architecture and things of that nature, out of ancient Egypt. And when they came and studied these different things, they took it with them and they, built up Greece. Now, of course, when the other powers, when Greece fell, it was still a viable culture at the time of the Romans. So the Romans weren't intellectuals at all. They imported Greeks, to help build their society and build their thing up. And so, with the formation of Rome, of course, it had a grip all on the Western world. And, a lot of our English, culture and language is derived from the Latin, because of Rome and Greece. And so the technology and the things go along from Egypt to Greece to Rome to England. And some of that, of course, goes into the empire of the Muslims. So the Muslims expand upon that, invent algebra, based on the things that they found, in Egypt. So that's, matter of fact, the word algebra is Arabic, and things to certain like medical instruments, that you still use today, or you find them in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians had, what do you call them? Your dentures. Like, they were working with dentures. Cast and stuff for your feet, in terms of ship making and boat making, which other people improved upon. They also borrowed as well. So when they borrowed a chariot, from the Middle Eastern powers. They improved upon that and, was able to utilize it and perfect it, that it was a war instrument. And from there, other people took that and built upon that. So it's this kind of exchange that goes back and forth. Matter of fact, we're typing with these quote unquote Latin letters, but they come from Egyptian by way of the Phoenicians. So the Semitic speakers were working for the Egyptians in the mines in the Sinai, and created this and created these scripts that were based on the Meta Nature scripts. And this is what became the Phoenician scripts, which also the Greeks borrowed, and it became the Greek alphabet, which the Romans borrowed, which became the Latin alphabet, which becomes what you see across the screen right here. So you're actually reading Meta Nature in a simplified form. And so when we talk about what did Egypt give, saying to the world, like you're benefiting from the binary system itself, to the written letters, to the architectural styles, to the concept of a monotheistic deity, for example, for those who still have those religious connections in terms of monotheism in culture. It's just an array of things that happen. Even the concept of an empire. Remember that this is your first large civilization. This is your first empire at a point. And so when ancient Egypt fell, that's when you start to see West African empires, because they're trying to fill a gap, a power gap, and they're trying to imitate ancient Egypt, at the time. So first comes Ghana, and then Mali, Songhai, all building, trying to recreate what happened in the Nile Valley.
Right. And so when we speak of Kemet versus Egypt, or Meta Nature versus hieroglyphics, pardon me, could you tell us about what's the difference and why is there a difference?
Well, let's kind of go back. Hieroglyphics is the Greek rendition of what the ancient Egyptians called Sesh Meta Nature. So Sesh Meta Nature is the writings of the divine, or the writings of the words of God. And so, these were pictorial representations of nature that, had in many instances phonetic values assigned to some of the pictographs, which became the basis for the writing script. And so, but all hieroglyphs means is sacred writings. And so, it's, even though it's the Greek word, it's still within the same conceptual sphere as the Sesh Meta Nature, which are the writings or divine, or God's words, or God's written words, to be exact. That's how you would properly define that. And so now with Egypt is a Greek pronunciation of an ancient Egyptian word.
Okay.
So it's just like if you was to say Horus. Horus is just a Greek pronunciation of Horu or Huru. And, they have the Greek suffix. So like, it's like in English, when we say Kemetic, the ik behind Kemetic is not part of the Egyptian language. It's part of our English language. But we have to say that, because of the way that our language is framed and how we understand it. So it's the same thing with the Greeks, what they did with Horus, with the S suffix, which is a Greek suffix. And so the word Egypt was just a region, kind of a temple dedicated to Ptah, but it became the name of the whole area. And then eventually that's what the Greeks called all of Egypt, but they also called it Kami or Keme. And so this is the Also the Greek pronunciation of the word Kemet. But by the time the Greeks come along, the T suffix has been long gone in the Egyptian language. So when we're saying Kemet, that's how they would have pronounced it in the Middle and Old Kingdom. But in the New Kingdom, the T suffix is dropped. So they just say Keme in terms of the language. Now, this is where it's going to be some controversy for, you know, some of the viewers or whatnot in my original research. Now, when you read most Egyptological literature, they'll say that the word Kemet means black land. And they're assuming that the root to the word Kemet is Kim, meaning black. Sheikh Anta Diop comes along in 1977 with his parent genetic text and argues that the word Kemet means black people. Well, I won't get into the long debates that arose in the 90s, you know, concerning this, but this is when I entered the picture, you know, in my early beginnings of research, and I decided to tackle this and to see whose arguments had more merit. And over the years, I've come to discover that neither argument was correct, and that Kemet has nothing to do with blackness itself. It has to deal with a land with an abundance of water and vegetation. Now we're going back to the beginning of our conversation. What's more important for people, you know, migrating and trying to build a society when they're looking for water and vegetation? And that's what they labeled this place. As a matter of fact, it is a common name across Africa with different pronunciations. Another pronunciation of the word Kemet is Buganda or Uganda. That's a dialectical variation. And I discussed that, you know, in the book. I have a whole chapter on the etymology of the meaning of Kemet. And I show where in Africa that you find these variations. And I even suggested a renaming of Africa, calling it Bukanda, because we don't know where the word Africa comes from. It's highly speculative in terms of this name. And then it's a name given to us by Europeans. Now, you know, the most likely rendition or argument is that it refers to a kind of a Berber tribe that existed in Tunisia at the time of Hannibal or whatnot. And they were called Afrika. But under the Roman tongue, it became Africa. And this is where we get the term. But they only reference this small group of people in Northern Africa. But just like the word Libya or just like the word Ethiopia, somehow it came to refer to the large landmass. But, you know, in terms of acts of agency and not being named by Europeans, you know, I suggested the name Bukanda because it's the most dominant variant of the word Kemet across Africa. And all of that is discussed, you know, saying in the text.
Bukanda. Okay, next question is from B-Man. Who are the modern day Songhai people?
The Songoi are just like the ancient Egyptians in the sense that they are actually a conglomerate of different people, a confederation of people who came together in ancient times. And matter of fact, there's a professor, Dr. Maega, who was actually of the royal lineage of Songhai royal lineage. He's a prince, you know, in his tradition, but he's also a professor. And he wrote a book, reconciling, it was something like reconciling oral and written tradition, or no, it's balancing oral and written tradition. And it's a blue text that you can find online. And he goes through the history of the Songhai people and how some of them come from Kemet, but some of them come from, you know, other areas around. And just like what we find in Kemet, they, you know, the circumstances forced them to make a federation, just like in the United States, they made a federation of different states that became the Songoi people. And so the Songoi aren't just a singular, they don't have a singular heritage, per se. It's just like African Americans. Like we have African Americans, but there was no African Americans in Africa. When we were in Africa, we were Ewe, we were Ashanti, we were Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Fulani, etc., etc. But when we came together, we became the African Americans in North America, in the United States. So it's a similar thing with the Songoi. But I recommend that book, balancing written and oral, or it's kind of reverse, oral and written tradition by Dr. Maega.
Okay. And so this next question is from, please blame it on my tongue and not my heart. What does Bantu mean? And is there a tribe called the Semi-Bantu people?
The Semi-Bantu?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard of Semi-Bantu, but I think that, how should I say? I think I've heard of that term, but it's more so in reference to a language grouping. And so we got to keep in mind that when linguists are labeling language families, it's not necessarily in conjunction with an actual people. It's just the name of a family of languages. So like with Bantu, there's no group that calls themselves Bantu. Bantu is just the label of these related languages. And I think it's Meinhof is the guy who coined the term in like 1881 or 1880, between 1881 and 1884. And the reason why he used that term is because when he was studying all these languages in Central and South Africa, they all had a variant of this word Bantu, meaning people. The word Ntu means being or existing thing. And so in the so-called Bantu languages or Bantu languages, they have a set of prefixes. Yes, and that's the text, balancing written history with oral tradition, the legacy of the Songhai people. Yes, thank you, the God King Darrell. They have these different prefixes, to their nouns. So you have a human class of prefixes. So into is the root, but when I want to say a human being, because the word into means being, I would say mu into. Mu being a singular human class prefix. But if I want to say people or human beings, I say ba into. Ba being the plural human class prefix. So that's where you get that term. But to my knowledge, there's no group of people called Bantu or Semi-Bantu. Semi-Bantu refers to these languages that aren't necessarily fully Bantu, but they have Bantu tendencies, as we would say, so they're semi-Bantu.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and we have one last question, I believe, from Love Jones Honey. What languages are used to decipher Medu Neter?
Well, the languages used to decipher Medu Neter was the Coptic and Greek languages. And so Francois Champollion, he was familiar already with the Coptic language. So the Coptic language is still spoken as a liturgical language amongst the Coptic Christian priests.
Okay.
And so, that language was still existing. So it is believed that the Coptic language is the last stage of the Egyptian language, starting from the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Demotic, and then Coptic. And so by knowing and understanding Greek and Coptic, they were able to do the first leg of the decipherment of the hieroglyphs that was on. And so you had what they called it was a stone that had Greek, Coptic, and the hieroglyphs on it. And it had the word, it first started off with deciphering the word Ptolemy. that was in the cartouches, in his name. So it's from there he recognized the Greek, and then he went into the Coptic and saw that that was the case, and then they went into the hieroglyphs. So with the stone in which it was on, it had all three of those languages on it. So Coptic and Greek was used to decipher the first leg of the decipherment in terms of the hieroglyphs. And so subsequent, researchers helped to decipher it more, as time went on. But it's Champollion who deciphered the hieroglyphic text.
And is there any aspect of Medu Neter that has yet to be deciphered?
The vowels. So the hieroglyphic script was written with consonants only. At least that's what we believe. So, it's also possible that each of the consonants probably had an automatic vowel behind it. And so since it was understood, it wasn't written to save space. So that's a possibility that is being entertained as well. But for now, we say we don't know what the vowels are. So we don't know how to pronounce it. So that's why Egyptologists will stick an E in between the consonants, so that when we're speaking with one another, that we can have a conversation, because it's hard to have a conversation just speaking consonants. Like I can't do it. Like, like it wouldn't sound like language. You need vowels. So to facilitate conversation, in terms of the hieroglyphic script, Egyptologists interject E's in between the consonants. That's why we say Hetep or Hotep, they'll stick an O in there, or Seneb, or something like that. We'll just stick E's or random vowels. Yeah, the Rosetta Stone. And but there's different stones that they use. So the Rosetta Stone is the first one, but there was I think two more. And so the hieroglyphic decipherment was a process that took several different things. But in each one of the stones in which they analyzed, it had more than one language on it. So the assumption was that the same text was written 3 times in 3 different languages. So if that is the case, and we understand 1 or 2, then we'll be able to understand the one that we don't know, which was the Sesh Medu Neter, the hieroglyphs. And so that's how they were able to go through that process.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. That's it for our questions. That's you gave us a lot. And thank you for the slides. Thank you for showing us better than you can tell us, because that visual was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
You mentioned your book, so I'm just going to give you a chance to let folks know where they can find your book and find you.
Yes. I have 2 books that I just released.
Okay.
And so this is Aluja Volume 2, China into Religion and Philosophy. This came out in January, and 2 months later, this book, Towards a Comparative Dictionary of Chicam and Modern African Languages. And, they're very comprehensive texts, but, you really want to know about ancient Egyptian religion and African religion in general and philosophy, then this is the especially Aluja Volume 2. This is more technical for those who are into language and linguistics, but this is for everyone. And also, I had a debate, or I'm in the midst of a debate with Dr. Wesley Muhammad on Ra, and whether Ra and Allah are the same deity. So the second half of this text is dedicated to the debate that I'm having with Dr. Wesley Muhammad. But it's a good case study, in learning about the intricacies of ancient Egyptian philosophy and religion. And we also deal with the science aspect in it. So if you want to know more about the question of the science and the binary and all of that other good stuff, I have 2 chapters in here dedicated to that. So it's a thick book. It's 8.5 by 11 and over 550 pages, in this. So you can get those books at my website, asarimhotep.com. So
Asar Imhotep, our guest today, one of the cast members of our HAPI film that is releasing this Saturday, July 18th at 7 p.m. Get your tickets at hapifilm.com. Brother Asar, stay with us in the green room. I'm just going to make some announcements and we'll be right with you.
No problem.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for joining us. And we want to send special thanks and shout out to a couple of folks that's in the house. Our HAPI family, Tahuti Films, King Simon, Dr. Maat, Shrine of Maat, Philippe Matthews, the African History Network, Sonetta Studios, Derek Hayes, Joel Sylvan, and Asar Imhotep Show. Every day this week, we will be having a HAPI Talks with one of the cast members of the HAPI film. You do not want to miss it. So join us tomorrow because we will be speaking with our special guest, Dr. Solange Ashby. She's also a cast member of the HAPI film. And join us on Wednesday at 7 p.m., same time, same place. And it will be a surprise. I won't tell you what's going to go down, but you just have to watch. It's going to be great. You can get your tickets again for the live premiere of the HAPI film documentary at hapifilm.com. It is this Saturday, July 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And those of you who buy tickets, you will get exclusive access to our panel discussion with the HAPI film cast. You do not want to miss it. Thank you again for all joining us for HAPI Talks. My name is Elena. Peace.